Welcome to the Exponential Edge podcast with your host, Arya Salur. I'm excited to have you join me on this journey, exploring the forefront of technological advancements and innovation that will shape our future. As a junior at Acton-Boxborough Regional High School in Massachusetts and the CEO of SecArmor, a cybersecurity startup, I'm fascinated by the transformative power of technology. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into 5 key areas that are poised for exponential growth in the next decade. We'll be exploring the realms of cybersecurity, generative AI, sustainability and climate tech, biotech and human longevity, as well as the reshoring of manufacturing. And we'll also go over rising startups disrupting the marketplace. These topics and businesses hold immense potential to revolutionize our world and redefine the way we live, work, and interact. Each episode will feature insightful conversations with experts, thought leaders, and visionaries who are at the forefront of these fields. In just 30 minutes, our goal is to provide you with 5 signature nuggets of wisdom from our guests. These key takeaways will empower you with knowledge and help you stay ahead in an ever-evolving technological landscape. Without further ado, let's introduce our guest for this week. Hi everyone, our guest today is Pras Velagapudi, the CTO of Agility Robotics. Hi Pras.
Hey Ari, glad to be here.
Great to have you. And first off, could you just walk us through your career journey? I know you went to CMU for your bachelor's, and you've been in an array of startups, including a robotics company, Platypus, which was pretty successful, where they tested for water quality. And I just wanted to ask you how all these experiences in different technologies have come together and influenced your perspective.
Yeah, so I kind of balanced my career a little bit, not sort of just happened organically, where I've kind of spent about half my career in academia and about half of it in industry. So for the first 10 years of my career, I was at Carnegie Mellon University. I started there for my bachelor's degree. I worked in Pittsburgh for a little bit. I came back for my PhD, and then I was there for a few years afterwards as a project scientist. And that has been a really formative experience for me. Really early on, while I was an undergraduate, I got picked up by Red Whitaker as part of the DARPA Grand Challenge project. And there, really early on, I was just this really young, nascent engineer, and I got to be working alongside folks like Chris Urmson and Kevin Peterson, who became like really formative people in the self-driving industry. Brian Selesky. They were all there at that time, like all in one place, and I got to kind of be immersed in that environment and see that project go live and go, compete in the Grand Challenge. And those folks, also competed in the Urban Challenge and are now all in the self-driving community. So really early on, I got to see really serious robotics at work. Kind of lucked out there. And then throughout my career, I got to work in field robotics. I got to deploy drones, work with ground vehicles. I got to work with folks like Sid Srinivasa and Howie Chosit, working on manipulation and snake robotics in the biorobotics lab. So I really got to just be a part of so many different projects while I was at Carnegie Mellon and so many different fields within robotics that really gave me a great broad perspective on all of the different problems that come about when you're trying to deploy things in the real world to do stuff, not just technology in a technological space like the internet, but technology in a physical space. And so that was all at Carnegie Mellon itself. Between my bachelor's and PhD, I actually worked at a company called Red Zone Robotics, and they do a very important but unglamorous thing, which is inspecting wastewater pipes and infrastructure. So we were building essentially a robot that would crawl along the bottom of very large sewer pipes, the ones that aggregate up an entire neighborhood and are maybe anywhere from 5 to 25 feet in diameter, and we'd be crawling along them and inspecting that infrastructure. And that is one of the most difficult environments out there. And so that was really, it sounds unglamorous, but it's actually a really important experience for me to see just how hard it could be to get sensor data, to get something to work underwater over long distances with a lot of noisy data with like damage constantly happening. Our robots had come up covered in like bits of shrapnel and rocks and stuff like that. And you got to play with all of these technologies and force them to work in these really extreme environments. And that was something that I carried with me, when I went back into academia for my PhD, really this sense of like, what does it take to get something to work in the real world? It's not as easy as you think. It's not a lab environment. There's so much more variability. There's so many more unexpected cases that can arise. And so I tried to use that in my PhD as I was doing my research, is to try and ground it out and how would I think this would transition. And then when I was a project scientist, I got to work with some really cool and smart people on projects that eventually led to some of the technology that was used in the DARPA Robotics Challenge. It was some of the technology that I took with me when we were at Berkshire Grey, the company that I started with after academia. So I'd say what I took from academia was, one, I got to work with a lot of really smart people. Just at Carnegie Mellon during that duration, so many huge names, really, really great to work with them. And the second part is I got to work on a real diversity of robots, and not just like focus on one application, but try a bunch of things and fail at so many things. I made so many bad robots that broke immediately, and each time it was like, oh, that's what I shouldn't do. And I don't think I'd be where I am today if I hadn't made so many bad robots in my career early on. So that was a luxury I got to have.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that later, with your challenges that you face. But guys, we're in for a really exciting and informative episode today, as Pras is going to go through his expertise with all the different spheres of technology and robotics, such as Gen AI, obviously a huge part of this podcast. And we're going to go into AR/VR in this episode as well. And maybe if time permits, we can get into Web 3.0. I've been meaning to talk about that a little bit on one of these episodes. And then obviously we'll get into humanoids, which is the focus of your company. So just to start off, I think it's important that we make the distinction for our viewers, and honestly myself too, because this is a learning episode for me as well. What is the difference between robotics and humanoids? Could you clarify?
Yeah, so humanoids, it's really a descriptor that's a subset of robotics. So in robotics, you can have abstract technologies like computer vision. You can have physical robots like snake robots or surgical robots or things like that. Humanoids is specifically dealing with a class of robots that are taking human properties, taking human form factors, shapes, social cues, and things like that, and incorporating them into the design of the robot. So they're like a subset of robotics. The exact amount and exactly what is taken is something that's a little bit fuzzy. So some people will say that, for something to be humanoid, it needs to have 2 arms and 2 legs and a head and all of that stuff. Some people will say, if it's got 2 legs and wheels, but it's kind of got arms in the same shape as a human, like that's kind of a humanoid too. And some people are really like, hey, it has to have an emotive face that's like got really human social cues. So exactly which the pieces are that you take from a human varies. At my company, we actually call it human-centric rather than humanoid, because it's not as important that we look exactly like a human. What's important to us is that if there's a human environment, like one that you or I could work in, that our robot would be able to also work in that same environment without modifying it. And that maybe doesn't exactly need, a human form factor, but it tends to be pretty close. So our robot does look a lot like a human. It has a couple of features that are different. So that's kind of the difference between humanoids as a subset and robotics as this broad category.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. And now let's just delve into one type of robotics, which you know very well. When you worked at Berkshire Grey, you specialized in industrial commercial robots that had to do with large-scale distribution for retail companies. So, when you're talking about this distribution, can you talk about the top 3 to 5 compelling use cases which you've worked on?
Yeah. So while we were at Berkshire Grey, and we did a variety of different use cases there, I mean, they all rolled up under kind of this big umbrella of something called material handling, which is this idea of just like moving stuff around, getting stuff in and out of containers and packed into the ways that they need to go to the next part of a process. And so there, like the top use cases that we would have would be things like sortation, which is essentially getting like a bulk flow of materials in and then being able to sort that out into the places that things need to go. So you might be sorting parcels, or you might be sorting eaches, which are like individual units, like a bar of soap or something like that. That's a huge use case because it's a continuous critical path use case. Every e-commerce or retail system needs to start with, I have a pallet of soap and a pallet of toothbrushes and a pallet of toothpaste, and someone ordered one soap and one toothbrush. So how do I convert from one to the other? And along that process, there's a bunch of different ways of breaking that down. The other thing that needed to be done was essentially doing bin operations, or bin and case operations. So sometimes what you're doing is not necessarily sorting, but you're like trying to transport or aggregate bins or cases to larger units of stuff. So that's things like palletization, depalletization, automated storage and retrieval. Like that's an entire other area where you're not like separating or combining things, but you're moving them from place to place to access them really well, right? So that's another huge area of automation that encompasses several systems there. And then another area where we were being used is essentially, it's not quite this different, but it's like not quite the same either, which is parcels and package handling. Essentially, once you've packaged something up for shipment, there's almost like a parallel flow that happens with those packages to get them combined and then separated out again to go through, for example, a hub and spoke distribution center in a logistics facility, so like a FedEx or a UPS. And so that was another huge use case that we'd be going after.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up, actually a few months ago, I talked to Paul Ambruzzo, who you probably know. He worked for Berkshire Grey as well. And we talked about the transformation of distribution leading towards mainly robots over the last 10 to 15 years. So I just wanted to ask your view on that evolution and maybe what these three aspects which you talked about have to do with that.
Yeah, so first of all, Paul is great. I work super closely with Paul, and props to get him on the show. Shout out to Paul. Um, the intensity, like automation, is really bringing a couple things to all of these flows, right? Why automate, right? There's a couple things. One is sort of the obvious one, which is that labor costs are going up. These are often strenuous jobs that are really intense. Like a sorting application might be a person sitting in a little circle of bins, and they're sorting things to one of those bins at 1,000 packages or units per hour for an entire shift. Like that's hard. That's strenuous. It's like not something people want to do for a long time. It's hard to staff, and it's like bad for people. Like it hurts your joints. It's not like healthy to do that sort of work for a long period of time. It'd be much better to have that person like supervising a sorter and maybe like unjamming it or break fixing it once in a while, and having a machine do all of that repetitive motion and sorting. It's also useful from an accuracy perspective. When you have automated sensors all through your process, you can track errors and reduce them down over time, and at least know when they happen. Like even if you ship someone the wrong thing, you ship them the wrong thing. You proactively deal with it. It doesn't just show up somewhere out of nowhere. So those are already trends that the industry is trying to support in various ways, and automation helps with those. Another piece of it is that automation enables you to be very consistent with your processes. There's a lot of things that you can layer on when you've instrumented your entire process flow. You can connect things up and know how long does something take to get through a part of the system and do it very repeatably. And that's super important as retailers are pushing for things like same-day delivery, where you need to be like super consistent in your process.
Mm. Yep. Thank you. And let's now look at a different type of robotics, consumer robotics. So obviously probably the main use case for these consumer robotics right now is robot vacuum cleaners. But I wanted to ask you, do you think it's a little weird that there aren't really many other very popular use cases for these consumer robotics, and what you think can be done to make the use of consumer robotics more widespread? What are some more problems that these consumer robotics can fix?
Yeah. So one thing I want to point out here, because it's not always obvious when people think about robots, is that someone once told me, you stop calling it a robot once it starts doing some task for you really well. You start calling it by the task that it does, right? So like when you think about your home, there's a lot of like robotic systems in there that you're not thinking about, like your dishwasher, your washing machine, right? They're increasingly intelligent, they're increasingly connected, and they use a lot of the same technologies. I think that's probably a trend that's nipping away in the other direction. We think of, hey, I want to put a smart robot into the home. And certainly at Agility, like that's one of our visions is that one day our robot could be in the home too, right? But from the other side, the technology that the home is equipped with is advancing with smart appliances and smart lights, smart home assistants. And that's really powerful too, because those are all pieces of the same automation of like what is happening in your home. You can tell where a person is, what type of activity they need, preemptively remind them about stuff they need to do, automatically kick off cooking, kick off cleaning. So where it's difficult is embodied stuff in the world. And the reason is, if you look behind you right now, you have all these plants and you have a pot and you have a rug and things like that and pillows. And they can be anywhere and they can interact with the robot that you're trying to move around in your home. The robot vacuum cleaners like Roomba was kind of revolutionary in its ability to easily and cheaply deal with all of that stuff without completely messing it up, right? And even then, you kind of have to Roomba-proof your house. But like they picked a good, simplified version of the problem, which is just getting around on the floors, right? And they really nailed a useful application. Like that's hard. That's hard, and many things won't be that sort of constrained to solve, right? And that's why we see there's this gap. There's like a lot of home robots that have been sort of made it to the lab or made it out to research or made it to early pilots, and then people don't know what to do with them. They can't like interact with anything. So I think one thing we're waiting on is for that side of embodiment, there's some manipulation and perception hurdles that need to be solved. And there's a safety hurdle because the bigger the robot is, the more safety that you have to bake into it. And a Roomba is small enough that most of the time it can't really harm you. It can trip you, which is actually something to consider. But if you have a larger robot, like say a robot that could pick up 5 or 10 kilograms or even 15 kilograms, that's enough force to harm someone. And so you have to think, okay, how am I not applying all that strength in any inappropriate way? That's a hard problem. It's one of the things that industry has a lot of conveniences about, but home environments don't. Like in industry, you can put a light curtain, you can fence it off, you can train everybody in the area about what the robots do. You can't do that at home. You've got kids, you've got pets, stuff like that. So that's a challenge. Safety is a big challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And people might inherently have a bias towards these robots as well. I mean, think about you use AI. AI is kind of an umbrella term, but AI is just synonymous, or it's just there in all of our lives. Like when you use your email, there's AI, and nobody really thinks about it. It's integrated in people's lives already. But when you think about robotics, there's a lot less people who have robots in their house. And also, when there's robots in a large scale public area, such as a grocery store or something like that, a lot of times people abuse or misuse the robot, such as maybe graffiti on the robot or just breaking the robot in general. There's a lot of times when people have been caught on camera in these stores doing things like that. So, can you talk about the public perception of robots and how you think that plays a part now in this kind of reduced or disintegrated like perception of them?
Yeah, so I think public perception of robots does track fairly culturally, right? So when you're talking about public perception, it's important to understand, where you're talking about it, within what demographic. A great example of this is the Hitchbot project, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It was an extremely simple robot that was basically designed to try and get from like one side of a country to the other, and it was completely reliant on people for help. It would kind of like slowly trundle along in some direction with like a flag and an indication of where it was trying to go, and they just started on one side of a country and then sort of track it and see what happened. And people would help it, people would give it a lift or things like that. And they got it to successfully go across, I think, Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands. Like it made it across, people helped it out along its way. They then tried to do the United States, from starting in Boston and making it to the West Coast. They made it to Philly before it was found stripped in a dumpster with its head removed, right? And so that didn't happen in other countries, but it happened in the US, right? And I think that's a little bit indicative of kind of the cultural norms and the cultural sort of what's considered appropriate for interaction with technology. In the US, there's a lot more of a demanding, like, this should be out of my way, and like this is not an entity that I need to respect or that has any sort of like rights or considerations of its own. People are perfectly willing to throw scooters in lakes just because they don't like them, right? With no thought as to like, okay, well, somebody owned that scooter and like worked really hard on it. Like someone like spent a lot of time assembling it, and you're polluting a lake. Like, why would you do this? Why not just be angry at the scooters and like vote against them or something, right? So that's something that's sort of particular to certain Western cultures, and not all. There's certainly very different cultural norms interacting. Japan is a great example because Japan has like this long and rich history of these collaborative helper robots, going all the way back to like Astro Boy, right? In their media, in their literature, and they're a lot more respectful. You don't see this type of behavior nearly as much. Not to say that it wouldn't happen, but just that it's a little bit against the norms that you typically see there. So it's really interesting, this whole public perception. I think that in a lot of cases, to be successful in the US, at least, you really need robots to one, not impede people in any way, shape, or form, right? Like it can't inconvenience them, or else they get really annoyed and they do like really drastic things against it. And it can't be perceived as taking something away from them, right? You want a message as you're putting in automation in facilities that like, this is taking the part of your job you don't want and letting you do the parts of the job that you do want. Being able to like do crew cycling and problem solving, and we're going to move the heavy boxes around for you. And people get really upset when the robots take the fun parts of the job away. Like, hey, we'll move all the light packages, and then you only have to deal with car tires and kayaks. Like, they don't like that. That's not a good experience for them. So I think that's a huge part of it. Right.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating how you brought up just the geological differences between selling these robots. And that's also been a huge theme that I've noticed throughout all these episodes is just the differences in marketing and the product itself in different geologies. So thanks for bringing that up. And just to end off this robots section of our episode, do you think you could, I usually do this at the end of the episodes, but I want to do it for each section of this one. Do you think you can give us about 3 key takeaways from what we talked about robotics today?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So one of them is that robotics is already here. We're already immersed in it, and things like smart appliances, and smart homes, and even not necessarily full self-driving, but like adaptive cruise control, these things, they're all out of the same ecosystem of robotics technology that's been around for decades, right? And so just because you have the little extra bit of embodiment where something's running around on wheels versus like it being your dishwasher or your fridge, it's still interacting with you as part of your life. It's still doing things for you. And, I feel like it's important to treat those as one holistic thing of just automation in the world that's affecting you, and both of them are problems that can solve for the same, or solutions that can solve for the same problems. The second thing is that it is important to understand how robots are perceived, especially in different regions. Like the difference between success and failure for a robotics company can be about whether people believe in your robot and whether they support you when you deploy them. If you deploy a bunch of robots into stores, right, you better have a good way for them to not get in people's ways, or else even if your robot does the one thing that it's supposed to do, it'll be rejected by the people that need to interact with it, and then it'll end up like being rejected overall, like, or can be, right? If like, scooters are a great example of like a technology that, like, in theory makes a lot of sense, but depending on exactly where you deploy it, people might be wildly against it because it just isn't what they want, right? Or it hasn't been messaged appropriately, or you're not dealing with the issues that people are experiencing as a result of your technology. So that's really important as well. And then I guess like the last thing would be, um, humanoids and robotics in general. Humanoids are really all about this idea that one robot can go into any human-centric environment. And it's a hard nut to crack. It's not the only way to solve the problem. As we talked about, there's like appliances and things like that can solve parts of the problem. But it is the point of humanoids is that you don't have to change anything. You don't have to install a special appliance. You don't have to carpet your floor a special way. You don't have to stick stickers up, in a certain way, or like make all your books be organized to the left. That's the dream. That's what keeps humanoids like in the public eye, and that's what excites me about working in the space.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's move on now to our second category, which is AI. So for me, through my episodes and from what I've read and learned about over the last few months, I think of 6 different types of AI. Symbolic, which is like spam filters, machine learning, such as these Netflix and Hulu recommendations per se, that can just give you shows based on what you've inputted into the algorithm. And then also deep learning, such as deep fakes, pretty controversial right now. But yeah. And then generative AI, obviously just creating new information. And then patterns in space and time. So time would be like Alexa, natural language recognition. And then space, like the robot vacuum cleaners, which we talked about before. So after me saying that, could you provide your take on these different types of AI and their impact on technology today? I'd like a different view,
Yeah,
an
so I think
expert's view per se.
the big difference I might offer is that a lot of the things you mentioned are really the same thing, right? And there's actually kind of maybe a different way of breaking down the space, which is around the techniques that are used to solve the problem, and then those techniques, the core techniques, are then applied out to these different types of domains by basically wiring them up in different ways with the same kind of core technology. And so when we think about that, one of the things you mentioned, symbolic AI, it's really like an approach that kind of preceded the advent of successful deep networks. And the idea was at the time, right, that, okay, the way to get AI to work is to build up these complex knowledge representations, essentially like create a symbolic representation of everything that's out there. Like I'm going to encode like every possible constraint around this particular domain. There's traffic lights and safety cones and stop signs, and if I put in every possible traffic thing and every possible traffic rule, I can basically build out an AI that like knows about all traffic laws, and I put that into self-driving, right? And that was the idea, and that is the idea behind symbolic AI. That's sort of over here. All the way on the other side is these non-parametric methods, which are the mainstay of a lot of the generative AI and deep learning, and all of these terms, which basically mean build a really deep, really big neural network and train it on something and produce an output. And that's behind recommender systems. That's behind deepfake technology. That's behind Gen AI. All of those are basically that huge core technology of build a huge deep network and learn stuff. And the reason that you can I guess a term for it would be model free, right? You can describe it as model free, is because you're not telling that network like what the structure is. You're not saying like, hey, there's an important thing called stop signs. You just say, hey, look, here's 1,000 images of stop signs and 1,000 driver inputs. And it's like, oh, every time a stop sign shows up, like the driver stopped. So I should do that too, right? That's the correct thing to do. But nowhere in there is there like an idea specifically of a stop sign. Now, the interesting thing is there is some idea. It's implicit in the network. You can actually look at activation potentials for a lot of these things and see that, like, hey, when a stop sign happens, like these particular nodes in the network fire, right? It's the neural part of the network. It's kind of interesting, but it's not a one-to-one correlation. It's like this vague, like this area fires. And sometimes you get like mirror neurons, which are like exactly one thing, but sometimes you don't. So that core technology has really become kind of the mainstay of a lot of the modern AI tools. It's like 5 of the 6 things you mentioned are all that at their core. And then on top of that, there's essentially like transformers, which are a specific structure of that network. There's been a number of structures, like recurrent neural networks and things like that, that add on pieces that make them good for particular problems. And we kind of not stumbled upon, through a large amount of hard work by a lot of people, found this structure that seems to now work really well for this type of tokenized input, like natural language input, or diffusion style generation, which is, kind of like what's used in a lot of image generation, where you like basically take random noise and denoise it away. It's almost like diffusion's really interesting because it's almost like that saying, if you're trying to sculpt something out of marble, is you look at the block of marble and then you remove everything that isn't the statue that you're trying to carve. Like diffusion works the same way. You start with random noise and then you remove all the things that aren't the image that you want to see, right? That's how it works. It's really amazing that it works. But that's also basically a type of network that's just simultaneously denoising a structure. And that could be an image, it could be a trajectory for a robot or something like that. So I think that's maybe the way I'd break it down, is that there were really the symbolic and model-based AI approaches. And then there's this large class of the non-parametric model-free approaches, which are largely neural network-based. And then this huge litany of neural network methods that turned into all of the modern recommender systems, image generation and video generation systems, the natural language systems that are used now in GPT-4 and all of those. Well, now they're multimodal, so now they're image and text and other things. But those are all those same type of structural models that have evolved over time, and especially in the last couple of years with the advent of or popularization of this transformer style structure of the network.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I appreciate you going into that, because it's a learning moment for me too. I can build my knowledge on AI more now because of that. So thanks for that. And now I just want to transition towards the AR/VR side of things. So this topic might be even more disintegrated than robotics. I mean, it probably is, right? Because the AR and VR are both pretty niche markets right now. I mean, how long have people been talking about VR taking over the world, right? And we don't really see that right now. It's not really that close to doing it. And Meta and Apple, these companies have put a lot of work into VR, but it's just nowhere near being the huge thing that it was supposed to be. So, can you talk about VR, AR, and if it's a technology, maybe trying to find a problem, if it doesn't have a problem to solve, and how you think this will evolve in the coming decades?
Yeah. So, I'll speak to this as, not necessarily a VR or AR technology developer. Like I've never developed the headset, but as a heavy user, because as part of embodied AI research and robotics research, I have used these extensively because we use them for capturing teleop, we use them for virtualizing robot data. So I've been using the headsets, for years and years. What I'd say is that there's a couple of things that sort of stand out to me. One has been that there has been progress. There has been very significant progress but it's been maybe slower than people anticipated. There's been physical hardware challenges to making, higher resolution headsets, more compact lenses, things like that, that really improve the usability of headsets. They've been getting a lot better, but maybe not as fast as one might have anticipated. So that's one thing to know. It's not that the field has been stagnant. But I do think that there is some friction in being able to introduce these into daily wear extended usage right now. One of the big things was, for a long time, the hard transition between AR and VR, right? VR headsets had, for a long time, the advantage of being able to sort of completely change the representation of the environment. Like, you could take a thing and completely replace it with a virtual thing. But for a long time, it was decoupled from the AR aspects of like pass-through of video, right?
Yeah.
And so you'd be constantly like mode switching between the virtual environment, the real environment, the virtual environment. And I remember having to do this as I'd like put on the headset, do one thing with the robot, then take off the headset, and like interact with a keyboard or like interact with the physical robot, and then put the headset back on, because it was just such a dichotomy. Now, I think the latest generation of hardware has really attempted to assuage that with like the move to this idea of XR, which is combining the two modalities and pass through. Because I think there's a recognition that like that was a huge pain point. But that XR integration is still not perfect. You're wearing the headset and it's like slightly delayed, not quite, a completely fluid experience. And then there's AR headsets, which do give you that really, obviously optically clear pass through, because they're just passing actual light through, but then they're sort of limited in field of view and some of the other performance characteristics. So like we're still trying to bridge that gap of like really good pass through, but also like not having to have bulky hardware and not having to have some of the latencies and distortions of like the camera based pass through. Those are being minimized over time. But like until you can really wear a headset all day, not have to remove it every once in a while to do one or two random tasks and then put it back on, like that's a big gap, at least in a productivity space. But I think that, with that, if that can be sort of assuaged, I'm certainly probably an early adopter. Like if it were possible for me to wear a headset reasonably over many hours a day, I'd probably use it for things like virtual monitors and stuff like that. Things that are more like productivity than like whole hog complete replacement of your entire environment, right? Like what would be useful to me is, hey, if I could visualize robot data on top of the real environment or have my monitors up so that when I'm traveling, I don't have to bring a bunch of monitors. I think those early applications are like ready to go. They're ripe for the picking once the hardware can kind of just get usable enough that, you can get over that transition of like, oh, it doesn't run out of batteries, and oh, it's not physically taxing to wear on my head for 5 hours, right? So that's where I see it going. And that's,
And I was lucky enough, I was able to do an episode at MIT's labs with a company called Augmented. They were from a startup incubator at MIT. So they had access to that lab. And I did an episode there. And they used VR and AI to help people with mental health issues and cognitive disabilities. So do you think that VR, XR, is going to move forward in these cases that have to do with applicability to the human psyche, or things that relate to human consciousness more than maybe like work cases, like what you use VR for? Or do you think
I certainly hope so. I think in general, those types of medical and therapeutic applications, they're great, and 100%. I think there will be applications there. They tend to be a bit smaller than the consumer markets. Like the set of people who have computer monitors is much larger than the set of people who might need therapeutic applications, right? And you see that with things like wheelchair-mounted robotic arms and stuff like that. Like they're great products. Like Canova has some really great products out there. But it's a smaller market and it's kind of more targeted, and that kind of limits a little bit how fast, how big the industry can grow around that alone. So I think that those applications will exist, but the ones that'll drive the hardware forward will be people looking for the commercial applications. Like you wouldn't necessarily be able to monetize or not monetize, fund developing out like a new ASIC or like a new complete like optical system from scratch. Like, a completely new lens system without kind of like the consumer size total addressable markets. But then once you do that, like then the therapeutic, then the assistive care type applications and treatment applications absolutely benefit. They can take all of that benefit of the hardware development, and like now they get it too, right? And they get to advance. So I think they are unfortunately like a little bit limited in their ability to drive stuff at like meta scale. So luckily Meta is investing, and these other companies can get some of the benefits of it by basically a larger organization kind of pushing up the waterline on the hardware and kind of like establishing these supply chains and key technologies that other players can use. But I'm very bullish on there being therapeutic applications. A number of years ago, read a paper that was really interesting about how wearing a VR headset that would essentially distort reality could have therapeutic benefits. Like you can make, for example, a really icy environment, and that would reduce the perception of pain for someone who had like a burn, for example. So there's a lot of things that you can do by shaping someone's visual reality to help them process information differently. So I think it's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And now let's talk about some of your projects. One in particular, I saw a video about this one, a robot called Herb, where it's attempting to separate Oreo cookie pieces, right? So one thing I was thinking about during this time is the challenges that this humanoid might face, as obviously these robots don't have the dexterity of a human. So I was just thinking about the amount of code and time it might take to have this robot not just crush the Oreo completely. So thinking about that, could you present us with some of the challenges for this particular case and for humanoids in general that they present?
Yeah, I mean, dexterous manipulation is one of those things that's like on everybody's radar in the humanoid space right now. You can see it in the videos that people are putting out, all of these things. So when we did the Oreo demo, we actually didn't have a lot of time to do the demo. I think we did it in, I think, a couple of weeks. So we didn't have a lot of time to implement a lot of new technology. So Herb was a robot, or is a robot, at the Personal Robotics Lab that was at Carnegie Mellon. It's now at University of Washington under Professor Sid Srinivasa. So at the time, we had basically the motion stack that we'd already built for Herb to do the manipulation that Herb was doing, which was kitchen manipulation, loading dishwashers, taking books off shelves and things like that, moving plates and cups. And we adapted that to the Oreo problem when Nabisco basically reached out and said, hey, we want to do a series on different people building machines to separate Oreo cookies. So the interesting part there, there's a couple of interesting parts there. One is that we had built up a library of relatively simplistic but general motion planning primitives of like moving the hands to particular locations, moving until contact and along contact, and moving until certain forces. And we were able to compose that into the stuff that moved around the cookies, right? Basically picking up cookies, moving them around, twisting them apart and so forth pretty easily. And so it's actually kind of different because these days, a lot of approaches are teleop or diffusion policy based, where you basically like have a human try and grab the cookie and twist it apart, and then you replay, or not replay, but you learn that in a diffusion policy that then will reconstruct that action each time for what it's seeing in front of it. The interesting part was like we were able to do that pretty well for this pretty difficult dexterity task by just having the right primitives and then just manually chaining them together. It was like, okay, move here, move until contact, twist apart using force along some axis. It turns out that a lot of manipulation problems are actually kind of decomposable that way. It's kind of interesting because now there's so much focus on trying to do it all teleoperated that you kind of lose track of like, well, the motion wasn't that complicated in the first place. It was just a couple of constraints chained together, like pushing buttons and things like that. They aren't fundamentally unknowable things. They're like, move forward until you push the button, do it over here where the button is. So that was kind of interesting. The second part was that we did crush a lot of cookies. We crushed probably 6 boxes of cookies. I don't know. I would eat all the remains. So I ate 400 Oreos that week. But like there was some amount of sensitivity there. And the hardware that we had at the time was force sensitive. But like if you move into contact with an object, one thing that's really interesting is that as you detect force, there's some latency in how fast you detect that force. And that entire latency is time when you're still moving. And so actually a similar problem at Berkshire Grey was when we would move into contact with an object, right? We would detect the contact with the object because we'd see a pressure change. Like the robot was still moving fast, right? And so we ended up having to basically put some amount of springiness into the end effector to basically compress while we were in the process of like initiating that reflex to stop moving as fast as we could, even for like 100 milliseconds. It was a noticeable distance. So that was something which was interesting that happened here as well, is even though we had force sensing, like we really had to either move extremely slowly or kind of already know pretty precisely where we were going, because otherwise you'd have to move just so slowly to detect those forces before you'd crush the cookie. Because the second you detected it, it was already too late. You'd already crushed it, right? That was kind of interesting as well. And then finally, with all filming experiences, right? Like even if your robot works well, there's all these issues with the filming that can happen. And so we'd like get a great take, but then the director was like, "Oh no, like I wanted it from this angle," and you're like, "Oh no, we just did it perfectly." And then the next take you'd break a cookie, and you're like, "Oh man." So that was, kind of a learning that like even if you're not trying to do any sort of like camera trickery, like the set and the director and the camera setup may require you to do a little bit of trickery just to reconstruct what actually happened,
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. And then finally, I wanted to ask about robotics and the funding of robotics in particular. So between VC firms and now the government, after the global conflicts that are increasing the demand for robotics, has there been a shift from VC funding to more increased government funding for robotics?
So I'm not necessarily in the government space anymore. Like I did used to do DARPA and MIRI and AFOSR contracts. Um, Nowadays, I'm strictly in industry and strictly VC funded. So I'll give you the perspective that I have, which is that no, funding for robotics has not. I mean, it has its ups and downs, but it's still very material, and there are a lot of robotics companies that are being funded right now in pretty significant ways. It's actually increased a lot in AI adjacent robotics spaces. So anywhere where that confluence of embodied AI is happening, that's seen actually huge boosts in funding over the past couple of years, really large, significant rounds of funding. There has been perhaps a little bit more defense funding, but there's always been some defense funding, and it's never really at the scale of VC funding. So even if the government's putting a little bit, VCs are putting in quite a bit as well, typically. And for larger companies, that's still the mainstay of how you're going to get your funding. Smaller companies or developing companies, yeah, they have been seeing some new programs that are interesting in light of some of this stuff. I mean, so Henrik Christensen just released a 2024 national, basically like a national strategy for robotics. So that's kind of an interesting one to read through. It kind of highlights where we do have some of the gaps in how we're supporting the robotics industry versus other countries. One example being China, who just released a strategic initiative to develop humanoid robotics. So their humanoid robots are getting a lot of state support, and there are a lot of companies emerging out of that. So the U.S. is sort of not quite at that level, right? Like they have their own sort of strategic initiatives, and there is an interesting interplay in figuring out what the right ones are going forward.
Yep. Definitely. Thank you. And then finally, like really finally, do you think you could just give us your 5 key takeaways from our entire conversation today, and then maybe go into what you think the future of technology is in these next coming decades?
Yeah, big question. I'll try to answer it. I'll try to think of 5 things, right? I think the first thing is that when we're discussing robotics, like robotics is already here. It's just which new emerging piece will like fall into place next, right? All of these things have been envisioned for a long time. Just key technologies emerge that suddenly like lock them into place where they're the right combination of the technology is ready and the market is ready, right? And then they just fall into place. So when we're thinking about where robotics is going to emerge next, it's not like there's going to be some bang whiz like, I never thought before that you could have a robot that did X. Like, no, probably someone tried and failed to do it 20 years ago and 10 years ago and 5 years ago. But maybe now, the market is ready, the cost of doing business has gone up, the technology has gotten better, and it'll just like fall into place. And that's where you see things pop onto the market, is when that little extra piece lines up. The second thing that, kind of comes out of this conversation with VR and XR, but I think applies to AI as well, is that there's technology out there that's advancing, it's cool, it's effective, but it doesn't necessarily meet all the requirements of a product market fit. It doesn't like have a home yet, right? And there's a lot of companies that are going to rise and fall because they have a cool technology and a cool application, but they don't necessarily have a product market fit worked out that's ready for it, right? Especially in areas like AI, where there's a low cost of entry, right? Like it's very easy to get started. It's very easy to get funding right now. It's very easy to sign yourself up for something that you're not going to be able to succeed at from a market perspective. And so that's an important takeaway, is that when we're looking at AI, it's not so different from what we saw in the VR AR field, where you can build out great stuff for a long time and not actually gain traction if you're not careful. One of the other things, I guess, is really interesting to me is that I think we're at a sort of very interesting point with humanoids. It's one of the reasons I joined Agility recently, a year ago now, is because I see it as potentially a place where some of these pieces are locking into place. And to your point about home robotics, not having seen a lot of home robots for a lot of time, right? The piece that is falling into place is this manipulation and navigation in home environments with all the diversity, and it's being powered by AI. Like the actual block that's letting us fall into place is this AI block that lets us generalize more broadly than before. And to our earlier conversation, builds upon these core technologies that have sort of been locking themselves into place in all of these different venues, like recommender systems, like speech assistants, and so forth. Like the same field is now adding a new block, which is embodied AI, and that's kind of where it gets really interesting. I think we will continue to see, and this is no surprise, very strong adoption of automation in industry. That's one of the places we deploy right now. It's never going away. It's definitely going to be an increased area of investment. And it has to be there because it's what's needed for all the things that we require of these supply chains, like same-day delivery and everyone getting exactly the packages they want with low error rates, and still being able to support decreasing costs over time, and being able to match the labor force that's available. Right, the number of unfilled positions in the warehouse market has gone up. It's almost doubled in the past 4 or 5 years, which means that there's a lot of room for automation. I think that's 4. Am I at 4? Is that right?
Yeah, I would say 4.
All right,
and
so
that's fine. You don't have to. If you can't do the 5th, it's fine. That was
I think 4 is probably good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for those. Thanks so much for joining us today as well. And thanks to all our viewers for tuning into this episode of the Exponential Edge podcast. And join us next time to learn about trends, businesses, and people that will see exponential adoption in the future. Thanks, Pras. Bye.